No one will buy me because I'm fat. That's what the girl cried in front of the whole town. Laughter echoed off the frozen storefronts, boots crunching in the snow. Her stepfather had dragged her to the auction block like she was a sack of grain, and no one offered a cent. Until a lone mountain man stepped forward and paid triple. But this wasn't just mercy. It was the start of a war. Because the girl carried more than shame and bruises. She held the key to the one thing every man in the high country would kill for, the water that could make a fortune or starve a valley. Now, with the railroad's riders closing in, the snow deep as a man's waist, and the wind carrying the sound of hooves, the man who saved her will have to choose, between the gun on his hip and the law in his heart. Every time I see your comments, I'm reminded how stories connect us across distances, backgrounds, and hearts. If values like respect, courage, and compassion still guide you, then you're part of this story too. The February wind cut through Pine Crossing like a knife, making the gathered ranchers pull their coats tighter around their shoulders. Steam rose from the backs of stamping horses and the breath of men calling bids on livestock. The muddy street outside the livery stable churned under boots and hooves, while the sharp smell of animals and wet hay filled the cold morning air. Clara Boyd stood shivering on the auction platform, her thin shawl offering little protection against the biting wind. Her stepfather Boyd's fingers dug painfully into her arm as he dragged her forward. The worn planks creaked beneath her feet, and she kept her eyes fixed on them, unable to look at the crowd gathering below. "Here's a deal for you, boys," Boyd's voice boomed across the yard, thick with whiskey despite the early hour. "Got more than I can feed through winter. Make me an offer." He shook Clara's arm roughly, making her stumble. The auctioneer, Jim Wheeler, shifted uncomfortably behind his podium. "Now, Boyd, this ain't exactly proper." "Proper?" Boyd spat into the mud. "What's proper about having to feed an extra mouth when feed's scarce? She eats more than a field hand and does half the work." Laughter rippled through the crowd. Clara felt her face burn with shame as the jeers started. "Might need 2 horses just to haul her," someone called out. "Better reinforce that wagon bed," another voice added. Clara's chin trembled as she fought back tears. The familiar ache of humiliation settled in her chest, heavy as lead. She'd endured Boyd's cruelty since her mother died 3 years ago, but this public shame cut deeper than any private torment. "No one will buy me because I'm fat." The words burst from her before she could stop them, her voice cracking with hurt and anger. A sudden hush fell over the crowd. In that moment of silence, boot heels thudded deliberately on the frozen ground. Clara looked up to see a tall figure pushing through the crowd. Her heart seemed to stop as Eli Brannock emerged from the press of onlookers. Everyone knew of the mountain man, though few had dealings with him. He stood head and shoulders above most men, his dark beard shot through with silver, and his buckskin coat bearing the wear of countless seasons in the high country, his eyes sharp as a hawk's fixed on Boyd with quiet intensity. Without a word, Brannock strode to the auctioneer's table. He pulled out a leather pouch and counted out coins with deliberate precision. The metal clinked loudly in the sudden quiet. "3 times your asking price," he said, his deep voice carrying clearly across the yard. "That's more than fair." Boyd's grip on Clara's arm loosened in surprise. "Now hold on." "Someone fetch the judge." Brannock cut him off, his tone brooking no argument. "We'll make this legal and proper." A young boy darted off toward the courthouse. The crowd buzzed with whispers as Boyd sputtered, clearly thrown off balance by this unexpected turn. Clara stood frozen, hardly daring to breathe, as her future balanced on the edge of a knife. Judge Wilson arrived quickly, his black coat flapping in the wind. His weathered face showed no surprise at the unusual scene. He'd seen enough of frontier justice to take most things in stride. "Mr. Brannock?" The judge nodded to the mountain man. "You understand what you're proposing here?" "Full guardianship," Brannock replied evenly. "The girl needs a proper home." The judge pulled out his pen and papers using the auctioneer's table as a desk. "Boyd, you're her legal guardian since her mother's passing. You're willing to transfer those rights?" Boyd's eyes darted between the stack of coins and Brannock's stern face. Clara could almost see the calculations running behind his bloodshot eyes. The money would cover his gambling debts at the saloon, with enough left for winter supplies. "Yeah, I'm willing," he muttered finally. The scratch of the judge's pen seemed unnaturally loud as he drew up the papers. Clara stood trembling, hardly able to believe this was really happening. The crowd watched in fascinated silence as Boyd made his mark, followed by Brannock's careful signature. "Get your things," Brannock said simply, turning to Clara for the first time. She stared at him, stunned by the lack of mockery or pity in his voice. Just those 3 words, spoken as matter-of-factly as if he'd bought a horse or a milk cow. I don't have much," she managed to whisper. "Whatever's yours by right," he replied. "I'll wait here." Clara hurried down the platform steps, her legs shaky beneath her. As she passed through the crowd, she heard murmurs but couldn't make out the words. She practically ran to Boyd's small house at the edge of town, gathering her few possessions: her mother's Bible, 2 dresses, a brush, and a cherished tin of hair ribbons her mother had given her for her 13th birthday. When she returned, Brannock stood exactly where she'd left him, as immovable as the mountains themselves. He nodded at her small bundle and gestured toward a sturdy wagon hitched to 2 strong horses. "Time to go home," he said quietly. Clara climbed into the wagon seat, clutching her bundle to her chest. As Brannock took up the reins, she caught a glimpse of Boyd already heading toward the saloon, his pockets heavy with coin. The crowd began to disperse, returning to their usual business now that the spectacle was over. The wagon wheels creaked as they turned away from the livery stable, leaving behind the scene of Clara's humiliation and unexpected redemption. She sat rigid on the seat, still hardly daring to believe this wasn't some dream she'd wake from to find herself back in Boyd's house. The afternoon sun cast long shadows through the judge's office windows as Clara perched on the edge of a wooden chair, her bundle clutched tightly in her lap. The potbelly stove in the corner clanged and popped, fighting against the winter chill that seeped through the building's old bones. Judge Wilson's pen scratched across official papers while Boyd lounged against the wall, already fingering the coins in his pocket. The judge paused to warm his hands over his tin cup of coffee. "Now, Mr. Brannock, this grants you full legal guardianship of Clara Boyd until she comes of age or marries." He cleared his throat. "You understand your responsibilities in this matter?" "I do," Eli replied simply, standing straight-backed before the judge's desk. Clara watched him from the corner of her eye, trying to read something, anything, in his expression. His face remained as unreadable as the granite cliffs above town. She fought down a flutter of panic in her chest. What kind of life awaited her with this stranger who barely spoke? The judge's stamp came down with a heavy thud that made Clara jump. Boyd pushed himself off the wall, already heading for the door. "Well, that's done then," he said, not even glancing at Clara. His boots clomped down the wooden stairs, and through the window she watched him make a beeline for the saloon. "Come along," Eli said quietly, moving toward the door. Clara rose quickly, following him out into the gray afternoon. Snowflakes had begun drifting down, lazy and thick, adding to the dirty slush in the street. They walked to the livery stable where Eli's mule-drawn sled waited, already loaded with supplies. Clara recognized sacks of flour and beans, wooden crates that probably held lamp oil, and other basic provisions. The mule's breath steamed in the cold air as Eli checked the harness one final time. "Up you go," he said, offering his hand to help her onto the sled's seat. Clara hesitated for just a moment before accepting his aid. His grip was firm but gentle as he steadied her, then arranged a heavy buffalo robe across her lap. The sled runners creaked as they pulled away from Pine Crossing. Clara watched the town shrink behind them, hardly believing how much her life had changed in just one day. The snowfall grew heavier, creating a hushed world of white. The mule's hooves made soft thumping sounds in the fresh powder, and the harness jingled quietly with each step. After what felt like hours of silence, Clara couldn't bear it anymore. "Thank you," she said softly, her voice barely above a whisper, "for what you did back there." Eli nodded once but kept his eyes on the trail ahead. The silence stretched on, broken only by the sound of their travel through the deepening snow. As dusk approached, the temperature dropped sharply. Clara tried to hide her shivering, but Eli must have noticed. He turned the mule off the main trail onto a narrower path that wound through a stand of pine trees. After a short distance, a small cabin emerged from the gathering gloom. "Weather station," Eli explained, his first words in hours. "Keep it supplied for when storms blow in." He helped Clara down from the sled, then quickly led the mule and sled under a lean-to shelter. Clara stood uncertainly in the snow until he returned and opened the cabin door. The interior was simple but neat. A stone fireplace, a rough-hewn table with 2 chairs, a narrow bed in one corner, and shelves holding basic provisions. Eli moved with quiet efficiency, starting a fire in the cold hearth while Clara stood just inside the door, unsure what to do with herself. The flames caught quickly, sending welcome warmth into the small space. Eli pulled out a cast-iron skillet and soon had salt pork sizzling over the fire. From his provisions, he produced biscuits wrapped in a clean cloth. "Sit," he said, gesturing to one of the chairs. Clara obeyed, watching as he assembled a simple meal. When he set a plate before her, the smell made her mouth water. She couldn't remember the last time she'd had a proper hot meal. Boyd had usually kept the best food for himself, leaving her to make do with scraps and cold leftovers. She ate slowly at first, then with increasing hunger as she realized Eli wasn't going to snatch the plate away. He ate his own portion in silence, but she noticed he'd given her the larger share of both meat and biscuits. Night fell completely outside the cabin windows. In the distance, coyotes began their evening chorus, their wild songs echoing off the mountainsides. Clara found herself studying Eli's profile in the firelight. His features were weathered but not unkind, and there was something steady in his presence that made her feel oddly safe despite her uncertainty. The question that had been burning in her mind all day finally spilled out. "Why did you do it? Buy me, I mean." She tensed, waiting for his answer, wondering what price she'd eventually have to pay for this rescue. Eli took his time responding, carefully wiping his plate with the last of his biscuit. No decent man could stand by and watch that. He met her eyes briefly. "You needed help. That's all there is to it." Clara turned this simple answer over in her mind as she helped him clean up after the meal. Could it really be that straightforward? In her experience, people always wanted something in return for their kindness. But there was no hint of ulterior motive in Eli's manner, no suggestion that she owed him anything beyond basic courtesy. As she settled onto the narrow bed, Eli had insisted she take it while he made up a bedroll near the fire. Clara listened to the coyotes' distant songs and the pop of burning wood in the fireplace. The day's events swirled in her mind: the humiliation at the auction block, Boyd's casual cruelty, and this quiet mountain man who had stepped forward to save her without hesitation. Morning light filtered through the weather station's frosted windows, revealing a transformed world outside. The storm had passed, leaving behind pristine drifts of snow that sparkled in the weak February sun. Clara stood at the window clutching a tin cup of hot coffee Eli had pressed into her hands, watching him prepare the sled for their continued journey. The mule's breath came out in great white plumes as Eli adjusted the harness. The animal stamped its hooves impatiently in the fresh powder, making hollow thumping sounds in the packed snow. Clara pulled her threadbare shawl tighter, dreading the cold journey ahead but determined not to be a burden. "Best get moving," Eli said as he came back inside. "Still got a fair piece to go and the snow'll slow us considerable." Clara nodded, gathering her small bundle of belongings. The morning air bit at her face as they set out, the sled's runners creaking through the deep snow. Their progress was slower than yesterday, the mule having to work harder to break trail through the fresh drifts. The cold crept steadily through Clara's worn clothes. Her hands, wrapped in the thin shawl, grew numb despite her efforts to keep them warm. She tucked them under her arms, biting her lip to keep from making any sound of discomfort. She'd learned early in life that complaining only made things worse. Eli glanced at her once, then wordlessly pulled up the reins. He reached into one of the packs and produced a pair of leather mittens lined with rabbit fur. "Here," he said, holding them out. "Should have thought of these sooner." Clara hesitated before taking them. "But won't your hands get cold?" "Got my own pair." He pulled them from his coat pocket. "These were meant for trading, but you need them more." The mittens were too big but wonderfully warm. Clara flexed her fingers inside them, feeling sensation gradually return. "Thank you," she said softly. They traveled through stands of snow-laden pines and across open meadows where the wind had sculpted the snow into graceful drifts. The sun climbed higher, but the air remained bitter cold. Eli occasionally pointed out landmarks, a lightning-struck tree, an oddly shaped boulder. but mostly they rode in comfortable silence. By late afternoon, Clara's muscles ached from sitting still in the cold. She was about to ask how much further when Eli gestured ahead. "Home," he said simply. Through the trees, she caught her first glimpse of his cabin. It sat in a natural clearing, its log walls weathered to a silvery gray by countless seasons. Smoke rose from the stone chimney in a straight column against the crystal-clear sky. A split-rail fence marked what must be a garden plot in warmer months, now buried under smooth white drifts. Eli guided the mule to a small barn beside the cabin. "Let's get him settled first," he said, helping Clara down from the sled. Her legs felt wobbly after the long ride, but she steadied herself and followed him into the barn where they unharnessed the mule and made sure he had fresh hay and unfrozen water. Finally, Eli led her to the cabin door. "It ain't much," he said almost apologetically, "but it's warm and dry." The main room was larger than Clara expected, with a magnificent stone hearth dominating one wall. A black iron cookstove sat to one side, and rough-hewn shelves lined with preserved foods and supplies covered another wall. A solid wooden table with 2 chairs stood in the center, a well-worn Bible lying open upon it. What caught Clara's attention most was a curtained alcove in one corner. "That'll be your space," Eli said, noticing her gaze. "Put it together last fall. Figured it might come in handy someday." He cleared his throat. "Got some spare quilts in the chest there. Make it comfortable as you like." Clara approached the alcove almost reverently. A narrow bed with a straw-filled mattress waited behind the curtain, and a small shelf had been attached to the wall. It wasn't much, but it was more privacy than she'd had in years. "I'll get supper started," Eli said, moving to the cookstove. "You settle in." Clara unpacked her meager belongings while Eli worked at the stove. Soon, the cabin filled with the rich smell of venison stew. Her stomach growled, reminding her they'd eaten nothing since breakfast. They ate in companionable silence, the stew warming Clara from the inside out. The quiet between them felt different now, less uncertain, more peaceful. As she helped clean up afterward, Clara found herself studying the cabin's details. The careful craftsmanship of the shelves, the neat rows of preserves, the well-maintained tools. Everything spoke of a man who took pride in his home and his independence. Later, as they sat before the fire, Clara watched the flames dance and finally found the courage to speak. "My stepfather," she began hesitantly. "He didn't sell me just because he wanted to be rid of me." She paused, gathering her thoughts. "He needed money to pay a debt to the railroad foreman. Mr. Jenkins?" Eli's face remained impassive, but she saw his hands tighten on the arms of his chair. "Jenkins has been watching this land," she continued. "I heard Boyd talking about it. Said Jenkins wants the water rights to the creek that runs through here." Something hard and dangerous flickered in Eli's eyes, but his voice remained steady. "We'll see about that," he said quietly. Clara wanted to ask more, but exhaustion from the long day was catching up with her. Eli must have noticed, because he stood and added another log to the fire. "Get some rest," he said. "Tomorrow's soon enough for worrying." She retired to her curtained alcove, listening as Eli pulled on his coat and stepped outside. Soon she heard the rhythmic sound of an axe splitting wood, steady and strong in the clear night air. The familiar sound soothed her, and Clara drifted off to sleep feeling truly safe for the first time in years. 2 days passed in a gentle rhythm of work and learning. The morning sun cast long shadows across the cabin floor as Eli showed Clara how to operate the cast-iron cookstove. Her fingers traced the dampeners and vents while he explained their purpose. "Too much air, fire burns too hot," he demonstrated, adjusting a lever. "Too little, she'll smoke you out proper." The stove responded with a steady warmth that filled the cabin. Outside, fresh snow blanketed the yard. Eli taught Clara how to gather clean snow in buckets for melting. "Always use the top layer," he explained, scooping pristine white powder. "Nature's way of filtering." Clara watched the snow transform into clear water, fascinated by how much was needed to fill even a small pot. The mule, whom she learned was called Jake, proved to be a gentle creature despite his stubborn reputation. Clara found herself looking forward to feeding him each morning, sneaking him extra handfuls of oats when she thought Eli wasn't looking. The barn's familiar smells of hay and leather became oddly comforting. To her surprise, Clara discovered she enjoyed the steady flow of chores. Each task had a purpose, unlike the endless, thankless work Boyd had demanded. Here, splitting kindling meant warmth, feeding Jake meant transportation, melting snow meant clean water for cooking and washing. The work left her tired but satisfied. On the third morning, Clara was adding wood to the cook stove when Eli's posture suddenly changed. He moved to the window, his expression alert. "Company," he said quietly. Through the frosted glass, Clara made out a figure approaching on snowshoes, moving with practiced ease across the deep drifts. Her heart quickened, remembering Boyd's threats, but Eli's calm demeanor suggested this was no threat. The visitor proved to be a native woman in her mid-30s, dressed in warm buckskins and a wool trade blanket. Her black hair was neatly braided, and she carried a leather bag over one shoulder. "Mariah," Eli greeted, opening the door. "Welcome." Mariah Two Feathers stomped snow from her snowshoes before stepping inside. Her dark eyes took in Clara's presence with interest but not surprise. "So the talk in town is true," she said, her voice rich and clear. "You've taken in a ward?" Clara felt herself shrink slightly under the woman's direct gaze, but there was no judgment in it, only careful assessment. "Clara," Eli introduced, "this is Mariah Two Feathers, a good friend and wise counselor." Mariah inclined her head in greeting, then reached into her bag. "I brought dried choke cherries," she said, producing a leather pouch. "Good medicine for winter health." She handed the pouch to Clara, who accepted it with murmured thanks. But Clara could see tension in the set of Mariah's shoulders. She had brought more than just berries. "There's trouble up by the creek," Mariah said, accepting a cup of coffee from Eli. "Survey stakes in the pines. Fresh driven, despite the snow." Eli's face darkened. "How many?" "Dozen or more following the water's course." Mariah sipped her coffee. "Once the thaw comes, they'll dam it. Need water for their camp and steam engines." Her eyes met Eli's. "The railroad doesn't ask permission, friend, they take—" Clara watched the exchange intently, remembering fragments of conversation she'd overheard between Boyd and Jenkins. The creek that ran through Eli's land was vital, not just for his use, but for Mariah's people downstream. "The treaties," Eli began, "mean nothing to them," Mariah finished. "You know this." They discussed options in low voices while Clara tended the fire, but she caught enough to understand the gravity of the situation. The railroad's expansion was like a tide, washing away everything in its path. After Mariah left, promising to return with more news, Clara helped Eli clean up from their visitor. The cabin felt heavier somehow, weighted with worry. "Why don't you just fight them off?" Clara finally asked, voicing the question that had been building. "You're a good shot. I've seen your rifle." Eli was quiet for a long moment, arranging kindling by the stove. "Violence feeds their excuse to take more," he said finally. "One shot fired and they'll bring in law enforcement. Claim we're dangerous folk out here, need civilizing." His voice held old bitterness. "Seen it happen before. Railroad wins either way." Clara absorbed this, understanding dawning. "So, what do we do?" "We think, we plan, we work together." Eli managed a small smile. "Speaking of which, see that notebook on the shelf? The small leather one?" Clara retrieved it, surprised to find it filled with carefully written Comanche words and their English meanings. "Mariah helped me put that together," Eli explained. "Thought you might like to learn some. Knowledge builds bridges better than bullets ever did." That evening, while Eli repaired harness leather by the fire, Clara sat at the table with the notebook. She traced the unfamiliar words with her finger, sounding them out quietly. Each one felt like a key unlocking a door to understanding. The first word she learned was friend, wuta. It seemed fitting somehow, as the snow fell softly outside and the fire crackled within. Despite the threat looming up by the creek, Clara felt a surge of determination. This home, this newfound family, she would help protect it, whatever came. A week of steady snowfall transformed the Highland cabin into a world of white silence. The storms brought both beauty and work, settling thick blankets across the roof that needed regular clearing to prevent collapse. Clara found herself settling into a rhythm alongside Eli, their days marked by the necessities of survival and the quiet satisfaction of tasks well done. One crisp morning, Eli showed Clara how to patch the cabin's roof with tarred canvas. The wind bit at their cheeks as they worked, but Clara discovered she had a knack for the careful placement of the heavy material. "Steady hands?" Eli commented, watching her smooth down a particularly tricky corner. "That's good work." The praise, though brief, warmed her more than any fire could. Such simple words would have been unthinkable from Boyd, who had only ever offered criticism and contempt. Inside, Clara devoted herself to mastering the temperamental cook stove. Her first attempts at cornbread emerged blackened on the bottom, but Eli ate them without complaint. By the week's end, she could produce a golden brown loaf that filled the cabin with its homey aroma. Her greatest triumph came with biscuits. After several failed batches, she finally achieved the light, flaky texture she remembered from her mother's cooking. When Eli took his first bite at breakfast, his eyes widened slightly. "These are proper biscuits," he said, reaching for another. "Your mama taught you well." Clara beamed, ducking her head to hide the pleased flush in her cheeks. "She did," she agreed softly, the memory of her mother's patient instructions suddenly vivid in her mind. The afternoon brought Mariah Two Feathers back to their door, her arrival heralded by the soft crunch of snowshoes. She carried a deerskin pouch filled with dried herbs that released a sweet, sharp scent when opened. "For tea," she explained, showing Clara how to measure the proper amount into the pot. "Good for the spirit on long winter nights." As they waited for the tea to steep, Mariah shared stories of winter hunts and the wisdom of tracking animals through deep snow. Clara found herself drawn in by the older woman's quiet dignity and direct manner. Unlike the townspeople who had always looked at her with either pity or scorn, Mariah spoke to her as she would to any other adult. "The deer leave different signs in deep snow," Mariah explained, her hands moving to illustrate. "You must learn to read not just their tracks but how they move through the drifts. The story is there, if you know how to see it." Clara nodded, soaking in every word. The way Mariah spoke of reading signs reminded her of something, tugging at the edges of her memory. That evening, as they sat down to a supper of venison stew and fresh biscuits, the memory crystallized further. Clara watched Eli breaking his biscuit into his stew, gathering her courage to speak. "My mother," she began hesitantly. "She used to talk about a paper. Something important about the creek." Eli's hands stilled. He looked up, giving her his full attention. "She said it proved we had rights to the water," Clara continued, the words coming faster now. "Before she married Boyd, when the land was still hers. She mentioned it several times before she got sick, but I was young and didn't understand why it mattered so much then." "Do you know where this paper might be?" Eli asked carefully, his voice neutral but his eyes intent. Clara frowned, trying to pull the memory into sharper focus. "She kept important things in a tin box. I remember the sound of the lid. It had a picture of Christmas cookies on it." She shook her head in frustration. "But I'm not sure where." "Take your time," Eli encouraged. "Sometimes memories need space to surface proper." They finished their meal in thoughtful silence. Clara helped clean up, her mind turning over fragments of the past like puzzle pieces. The wind picked up outside, howling around the cabin's corners and rattling the shutters. Clara lay in her bed that night, listening to the storm's fury. The sound reminded her of another night, years ago, when she had hidden under her covers from similar winds. Her mother had come in to comfort her, and Clara had asked about the tin box she'd seen her tucking away earlier that day. The memory suddenly snapped into place, clear as crystal. She sat up straight in bed, heart pounding. The tin box, she could see it now, her mother sliding it under Boyd's bed, behind his winter boots where he never looked. "Our insurance," her mother had called it with a conspiratorial smile, though Clara hadn't understood then what needed insuring. Sleep proved elusive after that. Clara lay awake, watching moonlight and shadows dance across the cabin's ceiling. The paper's existence felt like a burning coal in her mind, too hot to hold, too important to drop. She would tell Eli first thing in the morning, she decided. Perhaps that document was exactly what they needed to stop the railroad from damming the creek. Outside, the wind continued its wild song, but Clara barely heard it now. Her thoughts were full of tin boxes and water rights, and the possibility that her mother had left them a weapon more powerful than any rifle, the law itself. Clara woke to the muffled silence that meant fresh snow. Through the frosted window, she could see dark clouds massing on the horizon, their bellies heavy with another storm. Eli was already up, studying the threatening sky with a practiced eye. "Blizzard's coming," he announced over breakfast. "Won't be heading to town for that deed today." He pushed his bowl aside and began listing what needed doing. "Got to bank snow against the walls first. Keeps the warmth in better." They worked steadily through the morning, shoveling the fresh powder against the cabin's base. Clara's muscles protested, but she kept pace with Eli, determined to prove her worth. The wind picked up as they finished, driving stinging pellets of ice against their faces. Inside, they barely had time to shed their snow-crusted coats before the storm hit in earnest. The blizzard's fury shook the cabin, but the banked snow and thick logs held firm. Clara fed wood into the stove while Eli checked their supplies. "Might be here a spell," he said, counting jars of preserved vegetables. 2, 3 days by the look of those clouds. The first day passed slowly. Clara organized the pantry shelves, finding comfort in small tasks. Eli settled at the table with his carving knife and a chunk of pine wood. She watched, fascinated, as his big hands moved with surprising delicacy, coaxing shape from the raw wood. "What are you making?" she asked, pausing in her work. "Spoon," he replied, sending a curl of wood shaving to the floor. "Noticed you favoring your right hand with the metal ones. Wooden spoon's gentler on sore fingers." Clara blinked back sudden tears. Such thoughtfulness was still foreign to her, making her throat tight with emotion. To hide it, she fetched his old wool shirt from her mending basket and began working on its frayed cuffs. The second day dawned gray and wild. The storm showed no sign of weakening, so they settled into indoor tasks. Clara discovered she enjoyed the quiet companionship, the way they could work near each other without the need for constant talk. By evening, Eli's spoon was taking proper shape, its bowl smooth and deep, while his shirt sported neat rows of even stitches. On the third day, the wind finally died down. The world outside had been transformed into something alien and beautiful. Moonlight painted the drifts in silver, and every pine branch bore a thick coating of white. The silence felt almost holy after the storm's long rage. They sat by the fire that evening, the newly finished spoon lying on the table between them. Clara ran her fingers over its polished surface, marveling at how perfectly it fit her hand. "Thank you," she said softly. "No one's ever made something special just for me before." Eli nodded, his eyes on the flames. After a long moment, he spoke. "Had a wife once, Sarah, and a boy, James." His voice was rough with memory. "Fever took them both 6 years back. Weren't nothing I could do but watch them slip away." Clara held very still, sensing the rarity of this confession. "Couldn't bear the empty house after," he continued. "Too many memories. Sold everything and came up here. Figured solitude was better than ghosts." He glanced at her. "Been alone ever since. Till now." "I'm sorry," Clara whispered. "About your family." "Been a long time since I talked about them," he admitted. "Feels right somehow telling you." Clara gathered her courage. "I've never known what it's like to have a real father," she said. "Boyd only married Mama for her land. He never—" She swallowed hard. "Never showed kindness. Not once. I didn't know men could be kind until you bought me that day." "Ain't right what he did to you," Eli said firmly. "Man's supposed to protect those in his care, not sell them like cattle." Clara nodded, tears threatening again. "I used to pray every night for God to make him love me," she confessed. "Then Mama died, and I stopped praying altogether. Figured he wasn't listening anyway." Eli was quiet for a long moment. "Lord works in his own time," he said finally. "Maybe he was just waiting for the right moment to answer those prayers. Different way than you expected, perhaps." Clara considered this, watching the fire paint shadows on the wall. Without really planning to, she found herself folding her hands. "Dear God," she began hesitantly, "thank you for bringing me here, for giving me a safe place, and—" She glanced at Eli, who had bowed his head respectfully. "Thank you for sending someone who shows me what a father's love should be." "Amen," Eli murmured. They sat in comfortable silence after that, listening to the settling logs in the fire. Clara felt something shift inside her, like a wound finally beginning to heal. The storm had done more than transform the landscape outside. It had changed something between them too, forging a bond stronger than paper or law could make. When she finally went to bed, the new wooden spoon tucked carefully in her apron pocket, Clara realized she felt truly at home for the first time in years. The cabin wasn't just shelter anymore. It was becoming something she'd almost forgotten could exist, a family. The morning dawned crisp and clear, the fresh snow glittering like scattered diamonds. Clara finished the breakfast dishes while Eli disappeared into the storage shed. He returned carrying an old leather holster and a worn single-action revolver. "Time you learned to handle this," he said, laying them on the table, "hoping we won't need it, but best to be prepared." Clara dried her hands on her apron, eyeing the weapon with a mix of curiosity and apprehension. She'd seen guns before, of course. Boyd had several, but she'd never been allowed to touch one. "First rule," Eli said, his voice serious, "every gun's loaded until you check it yourself." He demonstrated how to open the loading gate and cylinder, showing her the brass cartridges nestled inside. His weathered hands moved with practiced care as he explained each part: hammer, trigger, sights. Outside, they set up empty tin cans on a fallen log. The morning air bit at Clara's cheeks as Eli showed her how to stand, feet planted shoulder-width apart. "Grip it firm but not too tight," he instructed, adjusting her hands. "Like holding a bird, strong enough it can't escape, gentle enough not to harm it." Clara's first shot went wide, the recoil stronger than she'd expected. The second kicked up snow far to the right of the cans. Her arms trembled slightly, but she set her jaw and tried again. "Take your time," Eli encouraged. "Breathe out slow when you squeeze the trigger." On her fifth attempt, one of the cans jumped and clattered to the ground. Clara's face broke into a surprised smile. "Well done," Eli nodded. "We'll practice more later. For now, let's get ready to visit Mariah." Promised her some supplies. They strapped on snowshoes after lunch, Clara having grown more confident with them over the past weeks. Eli carried a pack loaded with flour and bacon, while Clara balanced a smaller bag of coffee and dried apples. The trek to Mariah's cabin took them through stands of snow-laden pines, their boots crunching in the fresh powder. Mariah met them at her door, the smoke from her chimney rising straight in the still air. Her dark eyes crinkled with welcome as she ushered them inside, where a pot of tea already waited. "The spirits told me to expect visitors," she said, pouring 3 cups. Or perhaps it was just that clear sky after the storm. Clara helped unpack the supplies while Eli and Mariah discussed the weather. When they mentioned the deed hidden in Boyd's cabin, Mariah's expression grew serious. "I can help when you go to retrieve it," she offered, stirring honey into her tea. "I move quietly, and few pay attention to a lone Indian woman." Her tone was matter-of-fact, without bitterness. "Besides, I know the value of water rights. My people have fought too many battles over them." On their return journey, the lengthening afternoon shadows stretched blue across the snow. Clara was first to spot the new survey stakes, rough-cut pine poles driven into the frozen ground, red rags fluttering from their tops like drops of blood on the white landscape. "They're closer to the creek," she said, pointing. Yesterday's tracks in the snow showed where the railroad men had worked. Eli's face darkened. "Foreman's not waiting for spring thaw." He examined one of the stakes closely, moving his markers by inches, hoping we won't notice, taking more land each time. Clara felt fear curl in her stomach, but alongside it grew something else, a determination she hadn't known she possessed. This land, this creek, they were part of her mother's legacy, part of her own story now, too. Back at the cabin, Eli cooked thick venison steaks for supper, the meat sizzling in the cast-iron skillet. Clara made gravy from the drippings and served it over the last of yesterday's biscuits. The familiar tasks helped calm her nerves, but she couldn't stop thinking about those red-flagged steaks creeping closer to their water. "When can we go for the deed?" she asked as they ate. Eli chewed thoughtfully before answering. "Soon as the mountain trails are passable. Can't risk the sled in deep snow and we'll need to move fast." He glanced at her across the table. "You did well with the revolver today. We'll practice more tomorrow." Clara nodded, cutting another bite of venison. The weight of the gun had felt strange in her hands this morning, but she knew now why it was necessary. Some things were worth defending, not with violence, but with the strength to stand your ground. The creek, the land, this new life she and Eli were building, she would learn whatever she needed to protect them. The evening settled around them, quiet except for the crack and pop of the fire. Clara's muscles ached pleasantly from the day's activities: shooting practice, snowshoeing, hauling wood for the stove. She felt stronger than she had in years, not just in body but in spirit. When she finally climbed into bed, her dreams were not of fear or shame, but of standing tall, facing whatever challenges tomorrow might bring. The late February wind turned damp and heavy, carrying the first whispers of thaw. Snow slid from pine boughs in wet clumps, and icicles dripped steadily from the cabin's eaves. Clara stood in the doorway each morning, watching the transformation as winter's grip began to loosen. Inside the cabin, she had settled into a rhythm that brought her unexpected joy. The mule's morning feed became her favorite chore. The gentle beast would nicker softly at her approach, ears pricked forward as she carried fresh hay and oats. "You're spoiling that animal," Eli commented one morning, watching her brush the mule's winter coat until it shone. Clara smiled, not stopping her careful strokes. "He works hard for us. Besides, he's got kind eyes." The hearth demanded constant attention as the temperature fluctuated. Clara learned to bank the coals just right, keeping the flame steady through the day and night. She took pride in Eli's approving nod when he found the cabin warm at dawn. On the third afternoon of the thaw, hoofbeats approached through the slush. Clara looked up from where she was splitting kindling to see a courier on horseback, his mount's flanks dark with sweat despite the cool air. The man handed Eli a sealed envelope before turning back toward town, clearly eager to finish his route before dark. Eli broke the seal, his expression growing grave as he read. Clara set down her axe and waited, her heart quickening at the stern set of his jaw. "It's from Judge Harrison," he said finally, holding out the letter. "Railroads made their move. Filed legal intent to divert the creek soon as the ice breaks." Clara's hands trembled slightly as she took the paper. The formal language was difficult to parse, but the meaning was clear enough. Without proof of their water rights, the railroad would claim the creek for their own use. "Then we need Mama's deed," she said quietly. "It's our only chance, isn't it?" Eli nodded, folding the letter carefully. "We'll head down in 2 days if this weather holds. Any sooner, and we risk getting bogged down in heavy snow." He studied the sky, where pale sunlight filtered through thin clouds. "Need to plan this careful. Can't afford mistakes." They spent the rest of the afternoon gathering supplies for the journey. Clara helped check the sled runners and pack dried beef, hardtack, and coffee. Eli cleaned his revolver and taught her how to reload it quickly, though his face showed he hoped they wouldn't need such skills. That evening they sat at the table with coffee steaming in tin cups. A coal oil lamp cast warm light across the wooden surface, where Clara struggled with a piece of saddle leather. Eli had been teaching her basic leather work, but her stitches were still crooked and uneven. "Land's sake," she muttered, sucking on a pricked finger. "How do you make it look so easy?" Eli chuckled, a rare sound that made his eyes crinkle at the corners. "Years of practice. You should have seen my first attempts. Looked like a drunk bear had got hold of the leather." Clara laughed at the image, then held up her mangled work. "Well, this looks like a whole family of drunk bears had at it." Their shared laughter filled the cabin, and Clara felt a warmth that had nothing to do with the crackling fire. She set down the leather and wrapped her hands around her coffee cup, suddenly serious. "I feel safe here," she said softly, the words surprising her even as she spoke them. "I never thought I'd feel that way again, after Mama died." Eli's hands stilled on his own cup. He looked at her for a long moment, something profound and tender crossing his weathered face. When he finally spoke, his voice was rough with emotion. "Glad to hear it," he said simply, but Clara could see how deeply her words had touched him. They sat in comfortable silence after that, listening to the pop and snap of the fire. Outside, an owl called into the gathering dark, and somewhere far off, a coyote answered. Clara thought about the journey ahead, about the railroad men and their red-flagged stakes. Fear still flickered at the edges of her mind, but it no longer ruled her heart. The lamp burned low, shadows deepening in the corners of the cabin. Clara gathered up her failed attempts at leatherwork, knowing they needed rest before tomorrow's preparations. As she stood, Eli spoke again. "We'll head out at first light in 2 days," he said. "Best get plenty of sleep between now and then." Clara nodded, understanding all that wasn't said. The trip would be dangerous, not just from weather and terrain, but from those who wouldn't want them finding that deed. Yet looking at Eli's steady presence across the table, she knew they would face whatever came together. She banked the fire one last time before retiring to her curtained alcove, the familiar tasks grounding her against tomorrow's uncertainties. Through the window, she could see stars pricking through breaks in the clouds, a good sign for clear weather ahead. Their journey would begin soon enough, but for now, she was grateful for this moment of peace in the home she had found on this snowy mountainside. The mountain night lay peaceful until near midnight, when a desperate pounding shattered the silence. Clara bolted upright in her bed, heart hammering. Through the thin curtain of her alcove, she saw Eli already at the door, rifle ready. "Let me in, quick!" Mariah's urgent whisper carried through the wood. Eli yanked the door open, and Mariah Two Feathers stumbled inside, her breath coming in ragged gasps. Snow clung to her dark hair, and her eyes were wide with fear. "Riders coming," she managed between breaths. 6 men armed. Saw them cross the lower creek. She gripped Eli's arm. "The railroad foreman leads them." Clara scrambled to dress, fingers trembling as she pulled on her boots. The crack of splitting wood outside made them all freeze. Orange light suddenly flickered through the window. The storage shed was ablaze. "The mule!" Eli shouted, grabbing his coat. He burst through the door into the snowy night, gun raised. Clara ran to the water barrel, scooping up handfuls of packed snow. She hurled them at the flames climbing the shed's walls, but the fire only hissed and grew. Mariah joined her, both women working frantically to contain the blaze. The night erupted in chaos. Horses thundered into the clearing, their riders dark shapes against the flames. Clara heard the mule's terrified bray as Eli fought to free it from the burning shed. Gunshots cracked through the air, forcing him to dive for cover. Strong hands seized Clara from behind. She screamed and thrashed, but 2 men dragged her toward a waiting horse. Through her terror, she recognized one voice, Boyd's drinking companion who worked for the railroad. They lifted her roughly into the saddle, binding her hands to the pommel. "Eli!" she cried out. "Help!" He emerged from the smoke, firing his rifle. The shot went wide as more bullets forced him back. The men wheeled their horses around, one keeping a brutal grip on Clara's reins. They thundered away from the cabin down toward the valley. Clara twisted in the saddle, trying to see through her tears. The burning shed cast an orange glow over the scene, Eli attempting to mount his horse to follow, more shots driving him back. Then trees closed in and she could see nothing but darkness. The riders pushed hard through the night, snow spraying from their horses' hooves. Clara's hands grew numb where they were tied, and her teeth chattered from cold and fear. She tried to memorize their path, but the moonless night and unfamiliar terrain left her disoriented. Back at the cabin, Eli's rage burned hotter than the smoldering shed. He checked his horse for wounds, hands shaking with fury as he found a graze along its flank. The animal couldn't carry him far tonight. "You must wait," Mariah urged, leading the trembling mule to safer ground. "In darkness, they will hear you coming. At dawn, we can track them." Eli's face was terrible in the dying firelight. "They took her," he ground out. "Those cowards took my girl." "And we will get her back," Mariah said firmly. "But not by getting yourself killed in the dark." She touched his arm. "The mule needs tending. The shed needs checking for spread. We prepare now. We track at first light." For a moment, Eli looked ready to ignore her wisdom and charge off into the night. Then his shoulders sagged slightly. She was right. He couldn't help Clara if he was dead. They worked in tense silence, making sure no embers threatened the cabin. The mule's eyes still rolled with fear, and Eli spoke to it softly while checking for burns. The animal had been lucky. The shed's main beam had fallen outward, giving Eli those crucial seconds to free it. Inside the cabin, Mariah gathered supplies they would need for tracking: water, dried meat, extra ammunition. Eli's hands never strayed far from his rifle as he paced, watching the valley through the window. Every fiber of his being screamed to go after Clara now, but he forced himself to wait. Dawn would come soon enough. The sheds remained smoked in the snow, a black skeleton against the white ground. Eli's jaw clenched as he thought of Clara's frightened cry. He had promised to protect her, to give her a safe home. Now she was in the hands of men who had already proven their cruelty. "They will head for town," Mariah said, checking her own rifle. "The foreman will want witnesses that she came willingly to challenge your guardianship." Eli nodded grimly. The railroad man had planned this well. Take the girl, force a legal claim that she had run away from abuse, then use that leverage to secure the water rights. By the time the truth came out, the creek would be dammed and diverted. But he hadn't counted on Clara's strength or the allies who would come for her. Eli checked his pistol, then began gathering tracking gear. The night seemed endless, but finally, the eastern sky began to lighten. Dawn would come, and with it the hunt would begin. The eastern sky turned pearl gray as Eli tightened the last strap on his gear. His hands moved with practiced efficiency, checking his Winchester rifle and Colt revolver. Into his pack went dried jerky, a water skin, and extra ammunition. The familiar weight of weapons brought little comfort. Only finding Clara would do that. Mariah emerged from the cabin's shadows, her own snowshoes and rifle ready. She had traded her usual skirts for buckskin leggings, better suited for the hard travel ahead. Her dark eyes scanned the lightening horizon as she secured her pack. "The tracks are clear," she said quietly. "The snow has kept them fresh." Eli nodded, his beard frosted with his breathing. The pre-dawn air bit sharp and clean, and the stars were fading fast. He studied the trampled snow where the riders had taken Clara, his jaw tight with barely contained rage. They set out as the first true light touched the peaks. Their snowshoes made soft shushing sounds in the powder as they followed the hoof prints leading down into the valley. The horses had broken a clear trail, their riders too confident or too rushed to hide their path. The morning stretched on as they descended. Eli's mind churned with dark thoughts, images of what he'd do to the men who took Clara. His hand kept straying to his revolver, fingers flexing. The weight of the gun promised swift vengeance. Mariah noticed his restless movements. "I see murder in your eyes, friend," she said, her voice gentle but firm. "That path leads only to more blood." "They deserve whatever comes to them," Eli growled. "Perhaps." Mariah paused to study a broken branch. "But consider, a dead enemy can never undo his wrongs. A living one, properly pressured, might make things right." Her words cut through Eli's anger like a knife through hide. He remembered Clara's face when she spoke of violence, the fear in her eyes from years of abuse. Would more brutality heal any of those wounds? "There is power in outsmarting an enemy," Mariah continued as they walked. "More satisfaction, too, watching them defeat themselves." Around midday, they stopped at a frozen creek to rest and eat. The winter silence pressed around them as they shared jerky and sips of cold water. Eli sat on a fallen log, absently breaking small icicles from its bark. His thoughts turned to Clara. Was she warm enough? Had they given her food? "She is stronger than you think," Mariah said, reading his expression. "I have watched her these past weeks. There is iron in that girl's spine." Eli managed a small smile. There is at that." He had seen it too, in the way Clara tackled every new task, in her determination to learn shooting despite her initial fear. They resumed their tracking as the sun arced west. The trail led them through stands of bare aspen, their white trunks like ghost sentinels in the gathering afternoon shadows. Fresh tracks appeared where the horses had struggled through deep drifts, telling of tired mounts and impatient riders. Near dusk, they found where the trail turned sharply east, joining the old stage road that wound down to Pine Crossing. Eli studied the trampled snow, reading the signs of the horses passing. "They're pushing hard," he said. "Trying to make town by morning, I reckon." Mariah pointed to a rocky overhang nearby, sheltered from the wind. "We should rest here. Following in darkness invites ambush." Eli wanted to argue, to push on through the night, but the soldier in him knew she was right. Better to approach town fresh, with clear heads and steady hands. They gathered dry wood and made a small fire, well back under the rock where its light wouldn't betray them. The flames cast dancing shadows as they ate a cold supper. Eli checked his weapons again, more from habit than need. Above them, stars began pricking through the darkening sky. "Tell me your thoughts," Mariah said after a while. "I see plans forming behind your eyes." Eli stared into the fire. "The foreman will try to turn this legal. Claim Clara ran to him for protection." His voice hardened. "But a kidnapping's still a crime, no matter how you dress it up." "And the water rights?" "We get Clara first," Eli said firmly. "Then we deal with the creek." He looked at Mariah. "You still willing to help?" She nodded. "My people know the value of water, and of keeping promises. The railroad has broken too many of both." They settled in for the night, taking turns watching. Eli's last thoughts before sleep were of Clara, praying she knew they were coming. Tomorrow would bring either justice or bloodshed. He was beginning to understand which might serve better. The fire burned low and the wind whispered through the pines. Dawn would come soon enough, bringing with it the next phase of their rescue. But for now, they rested, gathering strength for what lay ahead. The morning sun cast long shadows across the snow as Eli and Mariah crouched behind a fallen pine. Below them, the railroad camp sprawled across a clearing near the creek. Steam rose from cook fires, mixing with wood smoke in the crisp air. The harsh sound of saws cutting ice echoed up the slope as workers harvested blocks from the frozen creek. Eli counted 12 tents arranged in 2 neat rows, with a larger canvas structure set apart, the foreman's quarters. His experienced eyes noted 3 men with rifles patrolling the perimeter, their breath visible in the cold. Near the cook tent in the center of camp, Clara sat on a wooden crate, her hands bound but her posture straight. Relief flooded through Eli when he saw she was bundled in a heavy coat. At least they hadn't left her to freeze. "They're keeping her visible," Mariah whispered, "to draw you in." Eli nodded grimly. "Expecting me to come charging down that hill, guns blazing." He studied the camp's layout through his rifle scope, marking each guard's position and routine. The morning bustle of camp life continued below, men loading wagons, tending horses, carrying water from the creek. Clara looked up suddenly as if sensing their presence. Though she couldn't see them hidden in the trees, her face held determination rather than fear. Eli felt a surge of pride at her courage. "I may have a way," Mariah said softly, "but I must go alone for a time. Will you trust me and wait?" Eli turned to her, questioning. She had never steered him wrong in all their years of friendship, but leaving Clara in enemy hands went against every instinct he possessed. "How long?" "Until mid-afternoon, no more." Mariah adjusted her pack. "Watch the camp, learn their patterns, but do nothing until I return." Eli wrestled with himself before nodding. "Be careful, friend." Mariah's smile was swift and sure. "Always." She melted into the trees like a shadow, leaving Eli to his vigil. The hours crawled by. Eli kept his position, making mental notes of the camp's rhythm. Guards changed every 2 hours. The cook rang a bell for meals. Men came and went in regular patterns, chopping wood, tending horses, hauling ice. He watched Clara being fed at midday, her hands briefly untied so she could eat soup from a tin bowl. The sun had passed its peak when Eli heard the soft crunch of snowshoes behind him. He turned to find Mariah approaching, her face flushed with exertion and triumph. In her arms she carried a battered tin box. "How did you—" Eli began, then stopped as understanding dawned. "Boyd's ranch was empty," Mariah explained, settling beside him. "He and his men rode into town last night, celebrating their payment from the railroad. No one watched the back door." Her eyes sparkled. The box was exactly where Clara said it would be, under the bed. Eli took the box reverently, running his fingers over its dented surface. "You rode all the way to Boyd's and back in half a day?" "I know shortcuts through the high meadow," she said simply. "And I had motivation." For the first time since Clara's kidnapping, Eli felt his face crack into a genuine smile. "You're a wonder, Mariah Two Feathers." She inclined her head, accepting the praise. "Now we have leverage better than bullets." Together they examined the box's contents. The water rights deed was there, yellowed but legible, signed and witnessed 15 years ago. Clara's mother had secured legal claim to the creek's water before her marriage to Boyd. The document's power lay in its simplicity. The railroad couldn't dam or divert the water without the deed holder's permission. "The foreman won't expect this," Mariah said. "He thinks the deed is lost or destroyed." Eli carefully returned the paper to its box. "We need to get word to Clara somehow. Let her know help's coming, but not with guns." Mariah considered the camp below. "The cook seems kind to her. Perhaps ... She pulled a small bundle from her pack, dried herbs wrapped in cloth. "These plants make good tea for winter colds. I could trade with him, speak where Clara might hear." Eli watched another guard change before nodding. "Do it. I'll keep watch from here. Make sure they don't hurt you." "They won't," Mariah said confidently. "The foreman needs local support too badly to risk antagonizing my people." She secured her rifle and pack behind a log. "When I return, we'll plan the next step." Eli watched as she made her way down to the camp, moving openly along the path. The guards tensed but didn't raise their weapons. Mariah's reputation among both settlers and railroad men worked in her favor. She was known for fair trading and healing skills. Through his scope, Eli observed as she approached the cook tent. She held out her bundle of herbs, speaking with the cook while Clara sat nearby. Though he couldn't hear the words, he saw Clara's slight nod of understanding. The message had been received. When Mariah returned, her face was serious. "The foreman plans to move Clara to town tomorrow. He means to force a quick marriage to claim the land legally." Eli's hand tightened on his rifle, but he forced himself to think clearly. "Then we move tonight. The deed gives us the law's weight. Even the railroad has to respect that." Together they bent their heads, forming a plan that would use paper and ink instead of lead and powder. As the afternoon light began to fade, Eli felt the rightness of this approach. Clara had seen enough violence in her young life. Perhaps this time justice could come without a trigger being pulled. The sun sank toward the western peaks as they refined their strategy. In the camp below, lamps began to glow in the tent windows. Soon darkness would provide the cover they needed for the next phase of Clara's rescue. Twilight painted the snow in shades of purple as Eli strode purposefully down the slope toward the railroad camp. The tin box was tucked securely under his arm, his steps measured and deliberate. His weapons remained holstered, a calculated risk that made his peaceful intentions clear. Shouts of alarm rang out as guards spotted him. Men scrambled for rifles, their boots crunching in the crusty snow. The camp erupted into motion, workers abandoning their tasks to watch the approaching mountain man. "I need to speak with your foreman," Eli's voice carried across the clearing, steady and strong. "Got some papers here he'll want to see." Clara's head snapped up at the sound of his voice. She straightened on her wooden crate, hope lighting her features despite the ropes still binding her wrists. The camp's large center tent flap pushed open, and a stocky man in a wool coat emerged. The foreman, his face flushed with either whiskey or anger. "Brannock, got nerve showing your face here." He gestured, and two guards raised their rifles. "Should have known you'd try something foolish." "Nothing foolish about the law," Eli replied calmly, holding up the tin box. "Got here the legal deed to those creek waters you're so set on taking. Signed, witnessed, and filed 15 years back." A murmur rippled through the gathered workers. The foreman's eyes narrowed. "Boyd sold us those rights fair and square." "Boyd never owned them to sell." Eli took another step forward, ignoring the rifles trained on him. "They belonged to Clara's mother before she married him. Her signature's right here, legal and binding. Judge'll back it up too." Movement at the edge of camp drew attention. Mariah appeared from the shadows, but she wasn't alone. Behind her came Reverend Matthews from Pine Crossing, his black coat stark against the snow. The town doctor followed, along with 3 prominent ranchers and the shopkeeper's wife. They spread out in a loose semicircle, silent witnesses to the confrontation. The foreman's face darkened. "This is railroad business. Ain't no concern of townsfolk." "The Lord's business is everyone's concern," Reverend Matthews spoke up, his resonant voice carrying across the hushed camp. "And his word is clear on theft and false dealings." The preacher opened his Bible, pages rustling in the evening air. "Thou shalt not remove thy neighbor's landmark, which they of old time have set in thine inheritance." More verses followed, each one striking home among the God-fearing workers. Men began lowering their rifles, uncomfortable with violence under the preacher's stern gaze. The deed's proper, Eli continued into the weighted silence. Clara holds legal right to the water, same as her mother before her. You try to dam that creek come spring, we'll see you in court. He met the foreman's glare steadily. Railroad might have money for fancy lawyers, but no judge will overturn a registered water claim. Not in Colorado territory. The foreman's jaw worked as he calculated his options. The watching townsfolk, the preacher's presence, the legal document. It all added up to more trouble than a single creek was worth. Untie the girl, he spat finally. A young worker hurried to comply, sawing through the ropes around Clara's wrists. She stood slowly, rubbing circulation back into her hands. Come on, Clara, Eli called softly. Time to go home. She walked toward him with dignified steps, head high despite her ordeal. Eli handed her the tin box, and she clutched it to her chest like a shield. The deed inside represented more than just water rights. It was her mother's legacy, her claim to belonging. This ain't over, Brannock, the foreman growled. Yes, it is, Mariah spoke up, her quiet voice carrying authority. Unless you want word spread to every settlement between here and Denver about how the railroad treats young girls and steals rightful claims. The gathered townsfolk nodded grimly. Such news would damage the railroad's already fragile relations with local communities. The foreman turned away with a curse, disappearing into his tent. The confrontation was over. Eli placed a gentle hand on Clara's shoulder, guiding her toward where their horses waited. The townsfolk fell in behind them, a protective escort through the darkness. As they walked, Clara's fingers traced the edges of the tin box, her mother's final gift securing her future. Thank you, she whispered to Eli, then turned to include Mariah and the others in her gratitude. All of you. Reverend Matthews smiled kindly. The Lord works in mysterious ways, child. Sometimes he uses a piece of paper instead of a sword to deliver justice. They reached the horses where Mariah had already packed Clara's few possessions retrieved from the camp. The night was clear and cold, stars beginning to sparkle overhead as they mounted up for the ride home. The journey back to Eli's cabin wound through snow-draped pines, their branches hanging heavy with fresh powder. Clara rode double with Eli, while Mariah led the way on her painted pony. The tin deed box, now wrapped carefully in oiled cloth, nestled safely in Clara's saddlebag. Afternoon shadows stretched long across the snow when they reached Mariah's cabin. Smoke curled from the chimney. Her cousin had kept the home fires burning during her absence. The warmth inside wrapped around them like a blanket as they stepped through the door. You'll stay tonight, Mariah said, not a question but a statement of fact. She stirred a pot of bean soup hanging over the fire, adding dried corn and herbs. The trail to Eli's will be clearer tomorrow. Clara sank onto a wooden bench, exhaustion finally catching up with her. The events at the railroad camp felt distant now, like a bad dream fading in the morning light. She watched through heavy-lidded eyes as Eli and Mariah moved around the cabin with the easy familiarity of old friends, setting out bowls and breaking cornbread. You showed real courage down there, Eli said quietly, passing her a steaming bowl, standing tall even when they had you tied. A small smile touched Clara's lips. Learned that from watching you walk into their camp like you owned it. They ate in comfortable silence, the only sounds the crack of the fire and the wind in the pines outside. Clara's shoulders gradually relaxed as warmth and food worked their magic. When Mariah offered her the bedroom for the night, she accepted gratefully, falling into a deep, dreamless sleep. Dawn broke clear and cold. They set out early, Mariah accompanying them partway before turning back to her own home. The familiar shape of Eli's cabin appeared through the trees by mid-afternoon, its windows dark and the yard showing signs of the recent struggle. Home sweet home, Eli muttered, surveying the damage. The shed's charred beams stuck up like broken teeth against the snow. Boot prints and horse tracks churned the yard into a muddy mess, but the cabin itself stood solid, untouched by the raiders' flames. They stabled the horses and carried their gear inside. Clara immediately set about rekindling the fire while Eli brought in fresh water. Within an hour, the cabin hummed with renewed life. Coffee perking on the stove, bread warming by the hearth, and their combined movements creating a domestic rhythm. Over the next few days, they fell into a pattern of steady work. Eli hauled fresh logs for the new shed, while Clara sorted through their scattered belongings and restored order to the cabin. Together, they rebuilt the shed's frame, Clara holding boards steady as Eli hammered. Her hands grew stronger, more certain with each task. A courier arrived on the fourth day, bringing supplies from town and taking the precious deed back to be properly filed with the judge. Eli paid him extra to hurry, knowing the sooner their claim was recorded, the safer they would be. One crisp morning, about a week after their return, Clara stood at the cook stove stirring a pot of coffee. Steam rose from the cups as she poured, carrying the rich aroma through the cabin. Eli sat at the table, whittling a new handle for his axe. "Thank you," Clara said suddenly, her voice soft but clear. Eli looked up, questioning. "For everything," she continued, setting his coffee before him. "But mostly for teaching me that worth isn't measured in what you weigh." Her fingers traced the cup's rim. "It's in what you stand for." The whittling knife stilled in Eli's weathered hands. He studied her face, no longer pinched with shame but calm, confident. "Reckon you taught me something too," he replied after a moment. His eyes dropped to the empty chair where his son once sat, then lifted to meet Clara's gaze. "Showed me a man can have a family again, even when he thinks that door is closed forever." Clara's breath caught. She blinked rapidly, fighting tears. "This cabin needed a daughter's touch," Eli continued gruffly, emotion making his voice rough. "Needed someone to fill it with baking and mending and—" He gestured vaguely at the neat shelves, the swept floors, the curtains she'd hung. All the things that make a house into a home. "And I needed a father," Clara whispered. "A real one." They sat in silence for a long moment, the coffee cooling between them as morning sun streamed through the windows. Outside, snow glittered on the peaks, and a gentle breeze carried the promise of spring. The creek burbled beneath its coating of ice, secured now for their future by Clara's mother's foresight and their combined courage. Eli cleared his throat. "Better drink that coffee before it gets cold," he said, but his eyes were warm with unspoken affection. "Got more shed work to do today." Clara smiled, wrapping her hands around her cup. "Yes, Pa," she said, testing the word carefully. Eli's shoulders straightened slightly, and though he didn't look up from his coffee, Clara saw his lips curve in a small, pleased smile. The morning stretched ahead, full of honest work and shared purpose, as father and daughter began their new life together. The Colorado highlands stirred with new life as April's warming breath swept through the valley. Winter's grip loosened day by day, sending rivulets of snowmelt dancing down from the peaks. The last stubborn drifts around Eli's cabin shrank beneath the strengthening sun, revealing patches of earth that had slumbered since November. Clara stood at the edge of the creek one bright morning, watching the clear water tumble over rocks newly freed from ice. Her boots sank slightly in the damp soil as she surveyed the flat stretch of ground she'd chosen for her garden. The land here, protected by towering pines, caught the morning sun just right. She knelt and plunged her hands into the dark earth, inhaling the rich scent of spring soil. Seeds from town lay ready in her apron pocket, carrots, beans, and hardy greens that could withstand the mountain weather. Eli had helped her clear the space of rocks and roots the day before, his quiet pride evident in every swing of the grubbing hoe. "That soil's good and ready," came Mariah's voice from behind her. The Comanche woman approached with a handful of corn seeds. "These are from my family's store. They'll grow strong here." Clara smiled, accepting the gift. Over the past weeks, Mariah had gradually moved her beadwork supplies into the cabin's spare room, filling the space with colored glass and thread and stories of her people's traditions. The cabin rang more often now with shared laughter as the three of them passed evening hours together. "Much obliged," Clara said, carefully tucking the corn seeds alongside her others. "Will you show me how to plant them proper?" Mariah nodded, kneeling beside her in the soft earth. Together they worked through the morning, marking rows and settling seeds into their beds. The creek's gentle music accompanied their labor, a constant reminder of their victory in keeping it free. When Sunday arrived that week, bright and mild, Eli announced they would attend the church picnic in town. Clara smoothed her best calico dress, now properly fitted after Mariah's skilled alterations. The buggy ride down the mountain filled her lungs with spring air scented with pine and new grass. The church grounds bustled with activity when they arrived. Quilts dotted the grass beneath an ancient cottonwood, laden with covered dishes and spring flowers. Children darted between groups of chatting adults, their laughter mixing with the calls of meadowlarks. Clara helped spread their quilt, setting out the berry pies she'd baked the day before. Her confidence had grown steady over the months, like a young tree putting down roots. She no longer hunched her shoulders or tried to make herself smaller when people looked her way. The preacher's blessing drew everyone to the food tables, where dishes of fried chicken, fresh bread, and spring vegetables waited. Clara filled her plate modestly, but Eli added an extra piece of chicken to it with a knowing wink. "Growing girl needs her strength," he said quietly. They settled beneath the cottonwood's spreading branches, the sun playing through new leaves overhead. Clara savored each bite, watching the community mill around them. No one stared or whispered now. She was simply Eli Brannock's daughter, nothing more or less. A shadow fell across their quilt, and Clara looked up to see young Tom Watson, one of the neighboring ranch hands. He shifted his weight nervously, hat in hand. "Afternoon, Mr. Brannock," he said politely, then turned to Clara. "Miss Brannock, I was wondering if you might like a piece of my ma's apple pie? She always makes extra." Clara felt warmth rise in her cheeks at being addressed so properly. "That's kind of you, Mr. Watson," she replied, accepting the plate he offered. Tom tipped his hat with a shy smile before retreating, but his eyes lingered on Clara's face. She watched him go, then leaned close to Eli's shoulder. "Guess someone finally thought I was worth the price," she whispered, her voice catching slightly. Eli's arm came around her shoulders and squeezed gently. No words were needed. They both remembered that bitter February morning that had brought them together. Now they sat in spring sunshine, surrounded by the buzz of friendly voices, watching the creek flow steady and free through the valley below. Clara rested her head against her father's shoulder, at peace with herself and her place in the world. The price Eli had paid that day hadn't just bought her freedom. It had given her the gift of knowing her true worth wasn't measured in coins or cruel words, but in love, family, and faith. Thank you for listening. Stories connect us in the most unexpected ways. If you felt that spark today, make sure you're subscribed. I share a new one daily, and the next might change your day.